Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to my lecture on Interaction Design 4th edition. And this is on Chapter 13. And Chapter 13 has a title that's different than the title shown on the title slide. And this is a great advertisement for user testing. Okay. Obviously, the authors let this get out of their offices without having actually checked whether this title slide was correct. Chapter 13 is called Introducing Evaluation. It's all about evaluation approaches and context. And what is interaction design is, I think, the title of the preceding chapter. Wow. Okay, so introducing evaluation. Let's do it. We're not going to talk about the goals here. We're going to pass that. So the chapter begins with a really nice kind of a theme: why, what, where, and when to evaluate. And we're really trying to place evaluation as just a part of a continuous process of iterative design and evaluation. Okay, so that's what we're trying to sell you on. We're not just going to design once and evaluate once, but we have this idea that we're going to do some number of cycles of this design and evaluation, and we're going to get ourselves to a point that we think is a pretty good place to be, and then we're probably going to stop for now. Okay, so just to walk through, the why, the what, and that kind of stuff. The why, well, we do evaluation to check users' requirements and that they can use the product and that they like the product. What do we do? Well, we might create a conceptual model, we might create early prototypes of a new system, and later more complex prototypes. Perhaps those early prototypes are low fidelity prototypes, and perhaps those later prototypes are higher fidelity prototypes. Where do we do it? Well, we could do it in the laboratory, or we can do it in more natural settings. When do we do it? Well, early and often, as they say. Throughout the design, finished products can be evaluated to collect information to inform new products. So, there's no exact right when. We're going to be talking about some different scenarios within the chapter here. But whenever we think that we can gain advantage by doing some evaluation, well, we're going to do it. We have a great quote here from a kind of interaction design pundit, Bruce Tognazzini. And here's what Bruce says. I really like this. Iterative design, with its repeating cycle of design and testing, is the only validated methodology in existence that will consistently produce successful results. If you don't have user testing as an integral part of your design process, you're going to throw buckets of money down the drain. Well, that's pretty convincing, isn't it? And we have a URL here to go to asktog.com for more discussions around design, evaluation, and Bruce's point of view. So what types of evaluations are there? Well, in the text in this particular chapter, we're breaking them up into three categories. Evaluations that go on in controlled settings involving users, evaluations that go on in natural settings involving users, and evaluations that don't involve users. So let's kind of talk through them in a little more detail. So controlled settings involving users are typical usability testing and experiments that you're going to conduct in some kind of a laboratory. Natural settings involving users are some kind of studies that you're going to do in the field, these so-called in the wild studies, because we want to see how the product works in the real world. Up in the first category, they include these living labs. And there's a pretty good discussion of this in the text where we talk about the idea that sometimes this dichotomy between the laboratory and the wild, i.e. natural settings, is not satisfying to us, in that the wild is too wild and the lab is not wild enough. So there have been a number of approaches that people have called living labs. And there's pretty good page-long discussion about this. I think it's one of those color text boxes in the chapter, in which they talk about things that people have called living labs. A primary takeaway: they're not all talking about the same thing, okay? But they pretty much all have the same goal, which is to get some of the advantages of the laboratory and some of the advantages of natural settings. So people have tried to do things like I don't know how I manage to not turn off my phone every time I do this, but I do. Apologies for that, guys. Oh, my phone was turned off, at least in theory. Okay, enough of that. So one of the things that they've done is they've taken, say, they've created a wired office, or they've created a wired home in which people can live and work either on a continuing basis or on a temporary basis, where they can gather a lot of data by being able to do, kind of automated observation. So with the idea that we'll get some of the intensive and controlled observation that we get from a lab, but also get some of the spontaneity and more natural usage that we would get from the wild. Okay, and those are a lot of good ideas. There's no one real dominant way to do that yet, but it's a promising idea that you ought to keep in mind. The third option here, settings not involving users, typically involve having experts analyze and model the user interface. Okay, and it could also involve the use of big data oriented analytics, where we take a user interface, we expose it to some users, and then we just we look at the hit rate of certain portions of it, and then we come to conclusions about the usability or the desirability of what we've done in the user interface from these web analytics, those kinds of things. Another thing is to take your design and have an expert evaluate your design in terms of heuristics. Some rules about what works and doesn't work. Now, I would point out, and there is a little discussion of this in the test, that this tends to, have some benefit, but it also tends to persist whatever the prevailing notion of what's good is. Certainly, if we were doing more direct user testing with real users, we would be more likely to discover things that aren't part of the general idea that people think are good. We might have some discoveries that could be beneficial, and we're probably not going to get that out of heuristics, which are always kind of backward looking. Living labs again. Okay, I forgot we had a slide on this. Okay, people's use of technology in their everyday lives can be evaluated in living labs. Such evaluations are too difficult to do in a usability lab, a real lab, where you're not having a lot of real life experiences. And we talk about the where home was embedded with a complex network of sensors and audio video recording devices. So here we created a kind of a place to go and interact with devices where we might be able to measure it, which is again a kind of a hybrid of in the wild and in the lab. Here's a diagram that I like a lot, not because it has a consistent use of symbols, but I guess it does have a consistent use of symbols. But it kind of gives you the feel about how you might take this kind of testing and evaluation and how you might have a series of actions that might lead to your design. So here they begin with a field study to evaluate initial design ideas and get early feedback. And then you make some design changes. Then you do a usability test to check specific design features. After that, you have a field study to see what happens when it's used in a natural environment. And then you make some final design changes. So there's no fixed way to use this evaluation and sort of intersperse it with your development of the product. But this is a realistic, illustrative scenario. There are two main case studies in the chapter. We have a lab experiment to investigate a computer game, and we have an in-the-wild field study of skiers. There's a smaller discussion of a crowdsourcing approach to evaluation that it goes on, which I think is more of an afterthought than a main event. Now, here's one of the things that I want to point out. Let me back up here. I want to point out that and this is a thing that's come up with our class this semester, is when we're doing testing and evaluation, are we always testing two alternatives? And the answer is it can be really enlightening if you really have two alternatives you feel strongly about, okay, and you have the time to test them both and to compare the results. That can really be great data that you're going to act on. You may not always have that wealth of information. You may not have two ideas about how to implement the user interface. You may only have one, in which case you still can test it and you still can get some feedback to see if it's usable as you thought it might be. Perhaps it has some problems, that you didn't anticipate. Okay, so we don't always have to do A/B testing, but in the first example here, we are doing A/B testing, which is pretty cool. So let's go talk about the first one, the computer game. So they had a computer game, and they evaluated it in the laboratory, and they wanted to make sure that they got what they were trying to see is how engaged players were when playing against another person as compared to playing against a computer. So they did a couple things. They asked the participants to self-report, but they also did a lot of physical measurement of things like respiration, perspiration, all the Asians, just to see what how intense of an experience it was, and I guess their hypothesis was that playing against another person was going to be a more engaging experience. And when you look at the results that they got, that was borne out by the data. What precautionary measures did the evaluators take? As I recall, half of the people played the computer first, and half of the people played the other person first, and they did some comparisons to see whether that had some kind of a bias on it. I'm sure they took other precautionary measures as well. That's the one that comes to my mind. So here we see the game players wired up and playing. And here we see some of the results. And the interesting thing is that playing against a computer versus playing against a friend, let's see, playing against the computer was more boring, it was less challenging, it was more easy, it was less engaging, it was less exciting, it was more frustrating, it was less fun. Well, that's about what they expected. Now, skiers in the wild was an in the wild experiment. They had some kind of smartphone device, which included a camera, a cell phone, a smartphone, a camera, an accelerometer, and mounted to a helmet. And they put people out on the ski slope, and they were expecting that the skiers were going to consult these things while they were skiing, and they were surprised to discover that serious skiers, or at least the ones that they had, don't want to play with their phones when they're skiing. They want to ski while they're skiing, but they did look at it when they got back to the ski lodge. So that gave them some real surprises about some of the features that they want to have and some of the usability issues, because they were not actually using it to any appreciable extent when they were out on the slopes. And you would not have found that out in the laboratory for sure. And here are some of the components of this e-skiing system. It's a pretty cool idea. So what did we learn from the case studies? How to observe users in natural settings. Unexpected findings that could come from in the wild studies, like what we discovered about the preferences of the skiers about when to use this kind of system. how to develop different data collection and analysis techniques to evaluate user experience goals such as challenge and engagement. It's certainly some of the physiological response measurements would not be things that I would think of right away, but I was impressed by those. The last thing that was talked about, the last of the cases that they talked about was a crowdsourced usability study. And they got some or all of the participants using an Amazon service called Mechanical Turk. And I just want to begin by saying that I think that Mechanical Turk is not a well-chosen term. It's a term that comes from a carnival term, where a Mechanical Turk was some kind of a fortune-telling or some kind of almost magical machine that actually had a person inside of it. Right, so it was and Turk, I think, came from the appealing and mysterious aspects of the Near East. Now, in a world where we want to celebrate cultural diversity, I don't think we want to use a cultural term in this potentially pejorative context. But the idea is an interesting idea. So why Amazon chose that name is really beyond me. But the idea is that instead of giving this to a machine, you have a platform which farms out little bits of work to a lot of people, and it might look like it's being done by a machine, but it's actually being done by a lot of people who are willing to earn a little bit of money. So this whole kind of crowdsourcing approach to testing was a thing that they talked about in the third study. And the interesting thing for me was they pointed to research, not from the study that they talked about, but from another study where people had tried this kind of crowdsourcing approach, and they found that they got comparable results in the research, although I think there is higher variability. There was some statistical difference, not one that worried them too much, at a fraction of the cost to something like half of the cost. So it's a promising idea. It's not where I would go if I were a practitioner. If I were in the process of learning to be an interaction design practitioner, that'd probably be an interesting idea that I would leave on my list of things to do someday. Here's a really good table where we're talking about the kinds of things that we can do with the kinds of evaluation methods that we had. And you remember, we put these things into three categories. The ones that involve users were either in a controlled or a natural setting, and the ones that didn't involve users were a third group altogether. So if we look at the methods, let's just go look at where they fall. Observing, well, we could either do that in a controlled or a natural setting. Asking users, asking people to self-report, well, we can do that in either a controlled or a natural setting. Asking experts is something we could do in a natural setting, or we could do without users. So we could give our product to some kind of expert in a natural setting. Probably wouldn't help us to get feedback from an expert in a lab setting, right? We could do it. It's just not going to, not going to help us a lot. We would do better to say, let's give our device to some expert and have them take it out on this ski slope and get feedback. And the kind of asking experts that we're talking about without users, this is the kind of thing where we're asking an expert to evaluate our interface in terms of past information about what good user interfaces are that have been distilled into what we call heuristic rules. Okay, testing we could do in controlled settings. If we were doing it in a natural setting, we probably wouldn't call it testing because it wouldn't be sufficiently controlled. Okay, modeling, this is the kind of thing that we do with modeling tools, and that it really comes before putting it in the hands of actual users. There's a really good kind of glossary in the back of the chapter in which we talk about all these terms that you see on the slide here, number 16. And I liked it. I read through it a couple times just to make sure that it agreed with the rest of the chapter, and I think it does. One of the one pair of terms that we see on here, formative evaluation and summative evaluation, were talked about early on in the chapter, whereas formative evaluation is going on early in the development cycle, where we haven't yet decided about what we're going to do, and summative evaluation is something we're going to do more likely on a finished product. So whether we characterize the evaluation that we're doing as either formative or summative has most to do with where we are in the life cycle of product development. There's a good discussion about participants' rights and getting their consent, and in my course, we're on our projects and on our practicing, we're doing consent forms, and typically the rights of subjects in research studies are very important things for practitioners to be aware of. They're especially important if you're doing research associated with some kind of a university. So universities who do live subject research have these institutional review boards, and among the things that institutional review boards do, they review the process taken by the researchers at that institution to protect the rights of research subjects to be informed about their circumstances, to understand how their data is going to be used, to understand that they're able to withdraw from the research whenever they want to, and to understand what measures are going to be taken to protect their identity and their information. There's a pretty good discussion towards the end of the chapter about things to consider when we're interpreting the data that come out of our evaluation. So here are some of the kind of axes of goodness that we would like to measure ourselves on. Reliability, we're going to measure, we're going to ask ourselves, does the method produce the same results on separate occasions? So how repeatable is it? Validity, does the method measure what is it is intended to measure, or accidentally are we measuring something else? Ecological validity, does the environment of the evaluation distort the results? And that's just kind of a subset of validity. Biases, are there biases that distort the results? And scope, how generalizable are the results? Can we only look at these data and come to conclusions about this one experiment, or do we feel that we can generalize to more situations, particularly ones in the real world with our real user base, with our actual product? And here are some key points that are made within the chapter. Evaluation and design are very closely integrated, and that's really part of that. There's a real pitch on slide 2 or 3 about how it's the only real proven way to get the kind of results that we want is to go at this iteratively. Design, evaluate, design, evaluate, design, evaluate, and you keep going around that circle until you say, you know what? I like where we are right now. Okay, we're going to stop for now. Some of the same data gathering methods are used in evaluation as for establishing requirements and identifying users' needs. For instance, observation, interviews, and questionnaires. Evaluations can be done in controlled settings, such as laboratories, less controlled field settings, or evaluation can even be done without the users, as we discussed. And usability testing and experiments enable the evaluator to have a high level of control over what gets tested, whereas evaluators typically impose little or no control on participants in field studies. So that's it for our chapter. I am hoping that some of this thinking will help you as you work on your final projects and other assignments that you're working on. And having said that, I'm going to say bye until next time. Bye-bye.